So the question about how to use sermon illustrations, a lot of times I try to actually ask a different question. And rather than how can I illustrate this, it's how can I animate it? How can I help people not just have an experience in their mind where, oh, okay, I get it, but actually with all of their senses. I see it, I hear it, I feel it. So sermon animation, rather than a clever story that you get out of a book, though there's a place for those, but a sermon animation might include a demonstration, an experiment, something visual. Recently, I began a sermon that had to do with marriage, and it was a series called Happily Ever After, and I just began the whole series. Hey, we're talking about marriage, and it occurs to me that we have some interesting symbols for marriage in our culture, and I lifted up a paper bag, and I pulled out a ball and chain. And so people laughed. I didn't have to say, let me tell you about a ball and chain. I showed it to them. And so that was a sermon animation that went beyond mere illustration. One other way that I would answer that question about how to use sermon illustrations or animations is a little bit interesting in the development of my ministry life. When I was a much younger pastor 25 years ago, I used illustrations a lot. And sometimes I look back at my old material and I'm like, yikes, way too many illustrations, way too clever, way too little proclamation. So I guess I would say as a more seasoned pastor, I use illustrations or animations more judiciously than I did earlier in ministry. So where do you find illustrations? And a couple of different answers to that one. I'll admit it, I've got books. The best book that I have is Tony Evans, and if you've ever heard Tony Evans preach, you know he's a master of the metaphor. But I have a book of Tony Evans illustrations, and not too much message prep goes by without me checking that book for the particular topic I'm preaching on. So that's one source. Always the second best source are those books, though. The best source, what's happened to you? What have you seen? How can you brainstorm your own experience? Every week when I get a message ready, there's always a little section in my note jotting of when I, people who, when I, and when have I experienced this? And what was this like? And how did I feel? And if you jot down enough of those experiences and memories, that always spurs on more. Just recently, just this week actually, I was working on a message that I'll deliver in a couple of months, and it had to do with the relationship of Holy Spirit filling and Jesus falling. Like the more you fall at Jesus' feet, that's when the Holy Spirit fills. And I just happen to remember a conversation from 22 years ago where a preacher told me that he had been asked with kind of a snide attitude, oh, are y'all one of those Christocentric churches? To which my preacher friend answered, I didn't know there were any other kind. And I don't either know that there are any other kind. And so I was able to replay that conversation, and it's going to be a good moment in that sermon a couple of months hence, because at Good Shepherd, we don't know there's any other kind of church other than a Christ-centered one either. So how do I organize my different illustrations? That's a great question, and in some ways I organize them like a dinosaur would. They're not organized digitally. I have old school files, and they start out with topics in the A's like abortion and addiction, and moving on to the C's like commitment, and the J's like, I don't know, maybe I have a file about Jesus, and the H's, the Holy Spirit, and on through Z's with zeal. And so through the years, back before it was magazine articles and newspaper headlines, oh, that'll fit, and I drop it in, and just through the years, those files have expanded and expanded. And then the priceless way of curating them is just somebody says something funny or insightful, and I will pause them and I'll say, "That'll preach," and then I'll go write it down and put it in a file. One other tip or trick I would say about illustrations is just use stuff about your own family with great caution and with not much frequency. It gets tedious on the one hand, and it can cause trouble on the home front. So I just would be real cautious. A second tip would be those stories that involve you don't ever want to be the hero of your own story. You want to either be the villain or the observer in it. You don't want to be the hero of the story because it's so egocentric. And I think we've all heard messages or even read writings from people who are the heroes of their own stories, and it just comes across as full of self. And hey, aren't we the kind of people who walk in John the Baptist's footsteps? He must increase and I must decrease.